Okay. Hello, Hal. Does it sound better this time? Hello, hello. Hello. Does it sound better this time, everyone? Or is the interference still there? Think it's all right to start? Still there, the interference? Bad when I flipped the camera. Was it okay before I flipped the camera? Oh! If I go like this, is it okay? If I go like this? How's that? Oh! I know what the problem is! I know what the problem is. It's Bluetooth. I got this morning. Did you see? It's a little Bluetooth drone, and the Bluetooth must be interfering with the Periscope broadcast. That's hilarious. Okay, I will banish the drone further away. It's charging its battery so I can see whether it actually works. Okay. Okay, now can you guys still hear me now? I feel like that Verizon, the Verizon commercial. Can you hear me now? As I put the drone very far away. The aviation menace, yes. So how are we? Leave the drone alone. This is not the drone you're looking for. Let's do all sorts of really bad Star Wars puns. Okay. Now that things seem to be working better now without the drone interference. Still some noise. Some noise. I can try unplugging it. I've taken the battery out of it. Does that... Whoa! My phone says it has been disconnected. Good now. Okay, cool. So taking the battery out of the drone caused it to stop talking to the phone, which I suppose I could have stopped it from the phone's end, but I would probably end the broadcast by accident doing that. Okay, so here we go. On the last episode, reading the Nutcracker, we had finished the second part, I believe, the story of the hard nut. The Princess Pirlipat, cursed to ugliness by the evil Madame Mouserinks. The court astronomer and Drosselmeyer had just figured out that to break the curse, they need to feed Pirlipat the nut Crackatuck. And the nut needs to be cracked and given to her by a young man who has never shaved and never worn boots. And then after giving it to her, he has to close his eyes and walk backwards 7 steps without stumbling in order to break the spell. And upon hearing this, the king was ecstatic until he found out that they didn't have the nut or the guy, so he banished them, saying, "Don't come back until you find them." So, hello, welcome. We are just about to start. Here we go. The story of the hard nut concluded. The candles had just been lit the next evening when Godfather Drosselmeyer did indeed arrive in Marie's room and resume his story. Drosselmeyer and the court astronomer had been traveling from place to place for 15 years, and still they had discovered no trace of the nut Crackatuck. Children, I could spend 4 weeks telling you about all the places they went and all the strange and unusual things that happened to them. But I won't. Instead, I shall tell you only that Drosselmeyer was sick at heart and longed for his beloved native city of Nuremberg. One day, when he and his friend were smoking wretched tobacco in the middle of a large forest in Central Asia, Drosselmeyer was quite overpowered by homesickness. "Oh, Nuremberg!" he cried. "Oh, Nuremberg, my happy home! How foolish I have been to roam, and how I yearn to return to Nuremberg, my Nuremberg! where houses all have windows, and churches all have doors. As Drosselmeyer kept lamenting and lamenting, the astronomer, overcome with sympathy, began to moan. I'm seeing something over here that I think needs to go away. There we go. Is that the right person? It seemed unpleasant. As kept lamenting and lamenting, the astronomer, overcome with sympathy, began to moan so pitifully that he could be heard all over Asia. But after a while he pulled himself together, wiped his tears, and said, "Dear and esteemed colleague, why do we sit here lamenting? Why don't we go to Nuremberg? What difference does it make where we look for that wretched Nutcracker? You've got something there," replied Drosselmeyer, and heaved a sigh of relief. They both arose, knocked the ashes out of their pipes, and headed straight for Nuremberg. They had barely arrived when Drosselmeyer ran to his cousin, the carver, varnisher, and gilder of dolls, Christoph Zacharias Drosselmeyer, whom he had not seen for many years. The clockmaker told the doll-maker the whole story of Princess Pirlipat, Madame Mouserings, and the Nutcracker. The doll-maker clapped his hands in amazement and cried out, "Cousin, cousin, how perfectly wonderful!" The clockmaker also related the incidents of his long journey, how he had spent 2 years with the King of Dates, how the Prince of Almonds had rudely turned him away, how he had vainly consulted the Natural History Society in Squirrelville. In short, how he had nowhere found the slightest trace of the Nutcracker. While listening, Christopher Zacharias had several times snapped his fingers, twirled about on one foot, and clicked his tongue. In the end he exclaimed, "Good gracious! Heavens above! I can hardly believe it!" Then he tossed his cap and wig into the air, hugged his cousin with all his might, and cried out, "Cousin, cousin, you're a made man, because, if I'm not very much mistaken, the Nutcracker is right here in my house." Whereupon he brought in a box, opened it, and took out a gilded, medium-sized nut. "Here it is," he said, "and now let me tell you how I came by it. Many years ago, at Christmas time, a strange man came here with a sack full of nuts that he was trying to sell. Right outside my shop he got into a fight with a local nut seller, who felt very strongly that a stranger had no business selling nuts in our town. So the stranger put down his sack, and just then a heavily loaded cart came along and rode over it. All his nuts were cracked, except one, which the vendor offered with a mysterious smile to sell me for a 1720 20 kreutzer piece. I looked in my pocket, and to my great surprise found just the coin the man wanted. So I bought the nut and gilded it. I can't imagine why I paid so much for that nut, and why I prized it so highly. Every last doubt about it being the precious Nutcracker was dispelled when the court astronomer scraped away the gilt and found the word Krakatuk incised in the shell in Chinese characters. The travelers were overjoyed, and the doll-maker was the happiest of men when his cousin Drosselmeyer assured him that his fortune too was assured, since, in addition to a sizable pension, he would be supplied with gold for his gilding as long as he lived. The two travelers, the wizard and the astronomer, had already put on their nightcaps and were getting ready for bed when the astronomer spoke up as follows. "Esteemed colleague, one piece of good fortune never comes alone. Take my word for it, the Nutcracker isn't the only thing we've found. We've also found the young man who's going to crack it between his teeth and give Princess Pirlipat the beauty kernel. I am referring to none other than your cousin's son." And in his enthusiasm he protested, "No, I will not go to bed. I mean to draw up the young man's horoscope this very night." With that, he threw off his nightcap and set to work on his observations. True enough, the cousin's son was an affable, nice-looking young fellow who had never been shaved and had never worn boots. In his younger days, to be sure, he had been a jumping jack for a Christmas or two, but all traces of that had vanished, for since then his father had taught him proper behavior. Now, at Christmas time, he wore a sword and a red jacket with gold trimmings, and since he carried his hat under his arm, there was nothing to hide his magnificent pigtailed wig. There he stood in his father's shop, gallantly cracking nuts for young ladies, for which reason they called him Nutcracker. Next morning the astronomer threw his arms around the clockmaker and cried out, "It's him! We've found him! We've got him! He's found! But there are two things, my dear colleague, that must be borne in mind. First, you must make your excellent nephew a sturdy wooden pigtail, connected with his lower jaw in such a way that a tug at the one sets the other in motion. Second, when we return to the palace, we must take care not to tell a soul that we have brought the young man who is to crack the nut with his teeth. In fact, he must not show himself until we have been there for some time. I read in the horoscope that after a few others have broken their teeth trying to crack the nut, the king will promise the princess and his throne to the man who succeeds, and thereby restores the princess's lost beauty. Cousin Dollmaker was so delighted to hear that his son was going to marry Princess Pirlipat and become a prince and a king that he entrusted the boy entirely to the care of the two travelers. The pigtail that Drosselmeyer attached to his hopeful young nephew was a complete success, and thanks to this device the boy was able to crack the hardest peach pits. Drosselmeyer and the astronomer sent word to the palace that the nut Crackatuck had been found, and advertisements were put in the papers forthwith. By the time the travelers got there, several handsome young men, including one or two princes, had arrived, determined, thanks to the soundness of their teeth, to free the princess from the witch's spell. The travelers were aghast when they saw the princess. The little body, with its tiny hands and feet, could barely support the ungainly head. The ugliness of the face was accentuated by a white cotton beard that had sprouted over her mouth and chin. Everything happened as the astronomer had read in his horoscope. One beardless and bootless boy after another broke his teeth and jaws on the nut Crackatuck without doing the princess the least bit of good. When carried away semi-conscious by the dentists who were in attendance for the occasion, they sighed, "That is indeed a hard nut to crack." The king, in despair, then promised his daughter and kingdom to the man who would break the spell, whereupon the gentle and well-bred young Drosselmeyer stepped forward and asked leave to try. None of the young men had made such an impression on the princess. She pressed her little hands to her heart and sighed ever so fervently, "Oh, I do hope it's he who cracks the nut and becomes my husband." After young Drosselmeyer had graciously saluted the king and queen and Princess Pirlipat as well, the Lord High Chamberlain handed him the nut Crackatuck. He put it between his teeth, gave his pigtail a good tug, and crack, crack, broke the shell into many pieces. Adroitly removing a few fibers from the kernel, he handed it to the princess with a low bow, closed his eyes, and took a step backward. The princess swallowed the kernel, and wonder of wonders! The misshapen monster was no more, and there stood the loveliest of maidens. Her face was woven of lily-white and rose-red silk, her eyes were glittering azure stones, and her head was piled high with curled threads of gold. Drums and trumpets mingled with the rejoicings of the populace. The king and his whole court danced on one foot, as they had at Pirlipat's birth, and the queen, who had fainted for joy, had to be rubbed with cologne. The tumult was most upsetting to young Drosselmeyer, who had still to complete his 7 steps backward. But he kept his head, and was just raising his right foot for the 7th step, when Madame Mauserinks arose from the floor, piping and squeaking hideously. In putting his foot down, young Drosselmeyer stepped on her, and almost fell. Oh, cursed fate! A fraction of a moment later, young Drosselmeyer was as ugly as Princess Pirlipat had been. His shrunken body could hardly support the monstrously swollen head with the big protuberant eyes and the wide, hideously yawning mouth. In place of his pigtail he now had a narrow wooden cloak with which to move his lower jaw. Both the clockmaker and the astronomer were beside themselves with horror, but then they saw Madame Mauserinks on the floor, writhing in her blood. Her wickedness had not gone unavenged, for young Drosselmeyer's toe had struck her so sharply in the neck that she was doomed to die. But in her death agony, Madame Mauserinks squeaked in a most heart-rending manner, "Oh, Crackatuck, hard nut from which I die, hee, pee! You too, Nutcracker, will perish by and by. My son with 7-fold crown will bring Nutcracker down. Yea, never fear, he will avenge his mother dear. O life, blood red and milky white, I leave thee for the shades of night. Squeak!" With that last cry, Madame Mauserinks expired. She was carried away by the keeper of the royal stoves. No one had been paying attention to young Drosselmeyer, but then the princess reminded the king of his promise, and he gave orders to bring the young hero in. But when the poor fellow appeared thus disfigured, the princess held her hands before her face, and cried out, "Take him away! Take that nasty Nutcracker away!" Without delay, the royal bouncer seized him by his little shoulders and threw him out the door. The king was furious at this attempt to palm a Nutcracker off on him as a son-in-law. He put all the blame on the clockmaker and the astronomer, and banished them both from his kingdom forever. This last development was not in the horoscope that the astronomer had drawn up in Nuremberg, but that did not discourage him from making further observations, and he read in the stars that young Drosselmeyer would make the best of his new situation and become a prince and a king despite his ugliness. But, the horoscope continued, he would cast off his ugliness only if he could kill the son whom Madame Mauserinks had borne after the death of her 7 sons with their 7 heads, and if he could win a lady's heart in spite of his ugliness. And it seems that young Drosselmeyer, as most recently seen in his father's shop in Nuremberg, is a Nutcracker, but also a prince. That, children, is the story of the hard nut, and now you know why people say that was a hard nut to crack, and why it is that nutcrackers are so ugly. The judge had finished his story. In her opinion, said Marie, Princess Pirlipat was a horrid, ungrateful minx. Fritz, however, thought that if Nutcracker had an ounce of spunk, he would make short shrift of the king of the mice, and get his good looks back. That's the end of the story of the hard nut. And there we have Nutcracker and Princess Pirlipat after the reversed transformation. The next chapter is called Uncle and Nephew. If any of my esteemed Thank you. Yes, we made it. Through the story of the hard nut. There's a couple chapters left, and some large illustrations, concept art for the land of the dolls and Candyland. So, Uncle and Nephew. If any of my esteemed readers or listeners has ever chanced to cut himself on glass, he will know how painful it is and how wretchedly long such cuts take to heal. Marie had to stay in bed for almost a week, because she was dizzy whenever she got up. But after a while she felt better and was able to run around the house as merrily as ever. The toy cabinet looked lovely with its fresh new trees, and houses and dolls. And what pleased her most of all was seeing her beloved Nutcracker, who stood on the second shelf and displayed an excellent mouthful of teeth when he smiled at her. But then, as she was feasting her eyes on him, she suddenly realized, to her consternation, that Godfather Drosselmeyer's whole story had been the story of Nutcracker, and his battle with Madame Mauserinks and her son. Now she knew that her Nutcracker could be none other than young Drosselmeyer from Nuremberg, Godfather Drosselmeyer's charming nephew, who unfortunately had been transformed by Madame Mauserinks' magic. For even while listening to the story, Marie hadn't doubted for one moment that the skilful clockmaker at the court of Pirlipat's father was none other than the judge himself. "But why didn't your uncle help you? Why didn't he help you?" she lamented, as it became clearer and clearer to her that the battle she had witnessed had been a battle for Nutcracker's crown and kingdom. Hadn't all the other dolls been his subjects? And wasn't it as sure as anything could be that the court astronomer's horoscope had come true, and that young Drosselmeyer had become king of the dolls? As clever Marie pondered all this, thinking of Nutcracker and his subjects as living and breathing, it seemed to her that they ought really to live and breathe. But they did nothing of the kind. The inhabitants of the toy cabinet remained lifeless and still, but now, far from going back on what she staunchly believed, she blamed their lifeless condition on the magic spells of Madame Mauserinks and her 7-headed son. "But never mind," she said aloud to Nutcracker. "Even if you can't move or say the least little word to me, Mr. Drosselmeyer, I know you see into my heart, and know how devoted I am to you. Count on my help if you need it. At the very least, I'll ask your uncle to help you with his skill when necessary." Nutcracker didn't budge, but it seemed to Marie that the gentlest of sighs came to her almost inaudibly, but ever so sweetly through the glass panes, and that a little bell-like voice sang to her, "Dear, sweet Marie, protectress mine, thou standest by me, and I'll be thine." Marie took a strange pleasure in the cold shivers that ran down her spine. By then it was dusk. Dr. Stahlbaum came in with Godfather Drosselmeyer. Louise set the tea-table, and soon the family was sitting around it talking of pleasant things. Marie quietly pulled up her little easy-chair and sat at Godfather Drosselmeyer's feet. In a moment, when none of the others were saying anything, She looked straight into the judge's face with her big blue eyes and said, "Dear Godfather Drosselmeyer, now I know that my Nutcracker is your nephew, young Drosselmeyer from Nuremberg. He became a prince, or rather a king. It all came out just as your friend the astronomer predicted. But you certainly know that he's at war with Madame Mousering's son, the ugly king of the mice, so why don't you help him?" Marie went on to tell the whole story of the battle as it had looked to her, and was often interrupted by the laughter of her mother and Louise. Only Fritz and Drosselmeyer remained unsmiling. "Where on earth does the child get such crazy ideas?" asked the doctor. "Oh," said Mrs. Stahlbaum, "she has always had a lively imagination. Actually, I think it's dreams brought on by her fever." "I don't believe it," said Fritz. "My red hussars can't be such cowards. They'd hear from me if they behaved like that." But Godfather Drosselmeyer, smiling strangely, picked Marie up on his lap and spoke to her more gently than ever before. "Ah, my dear little Marie, you're luckier than I or anyone else. You're a born princess like Pirlipat, for you rule over a fresh and beautiful country. But you will have much to suffer if you mean to befriend the poor misshapen Nutcracker, for the king of the mice will beset him wherever he goes. But there's nothing I can do. You alone can save him, so be steadfast and loyal." Neither Marie nor any of the others knew what Drosselmeyer meant by these words. Indeed, Dr. Stahlbaum thought them so strange that he felt the judge's pulse and said, "Dear friend, you are suffering from cerebral congestion. I'll write you out a prescription." But the doctor's wife shook her head thoughtfully and said, "I have an idea what the judge is getting at, but I can't quite put it into words." The next chapter is Victory. Shall I save Victory for the last episode? We've got a good deal of pages, but a large number of them are illustrations. Would you like me to go on to one more chapter, or do you want me to save it for next time? Trophy. A victory trophy. Yes. Up to me. Up to me. I think I'll do one more chapter. I'll do the victory chapter. That will make the last bit more manageable for the final episode. How's that? Okay. Victory. Yes. Awesome. It wasn't long before Marie was awakened in the moonlight by a strange rumbling that seemed to come from one corner of her room. It was as though pebbles were being thrown and rolled about, and at the same time she heard the nastiest whistling and squeaking. "Oh dear, the mice are here again!" Marie cried out in fright. She tried to call her mother, but she couldn't make a sound or stir a muscle. And then she saw the king of the mice squeeze through a hole in the wall. With flashing eyes and crowns, he scurried across the floor and jumped up on the little table beside Marie's bed. "Hee, hee, hee," piped the king of the mice. "Give me your sugar balls, give me your marzipan, or I'll bite your Nutcracker to pieces." And then, gnashing his teeth most abominably, he slipped into a hole in the wall. Marie was so frightened by the gruesome apparition that she was very pale the next morning and could hardly say a word. 100 times she was about to tell her mother or Louise, or at least Fritz, what had happened, but then she thought, "Will anyone believe me? Won't they just laugh at me?" Still, it was plain to her that to save Nutcracker, she would have to sacrifice her sugar balls and marzipan. So that night she put her whole supply of these delicacies at the foot of the toy cabinet. Next morning her mother said, "I can't understand how all those mice could get into our living room. Look, my poor Marie, they've eaten up all your sweets." And so they had. The gluttonous king of the mice hadn't found the marzipan to his liking, but had gnawed at the edges with his sharp teeth, so that it had to be thrown away. Marie didn't mind about the candy. Actually, she was delighted, for she thought she had saved Nutcracker. So imagine how she felt that night, when she heard the squeaking and squealing close to her ears. The king of the mice was back again. His eyes flashed even more dangerously than the night before, and he whistled even more disgustingly between his teeth. "Give me your sugar dolls, or I'll bite your Nutcracker to pieces." And with that the horrid king of the mice scurried away. Marie was miserable. Next morning she went to her cupboard and looked sadly at her sugar dolls. And she had good reason to be sad, for you can't imagine, attentive reader, what sweet little figures, all carved and molded from sugar, little Marie Stahlbaum owned. There was a handsome shepherd with his shepherdess, tending a flock of milk-white sheep, with his dear little dog capered around them. There were 2 postmen striding along with letters in their hands, and there were 4 of the prettiest young couples, sprucely dressed young gentlemen, and daintily dressed young ladies, swinging in a Russian swing. There were some dancers, and behind them William Tell and the Maid of Orleans, who didn't mean much to Marie, but in the far corner stood a red-cheeked child, Marie's favorite. The tears came to Marie's eyes. "Oh," she cried, turning to Nutcracker, "dear Mr. Drosselmeyer, I'll do anything I can to save you, but it's very hard." Nutcracker looked so pathetic that Marie, who seemed to see the Mouse King's 7 mouths open wide, ready to gobble the poor boy up, decided to sacrifice every one of her sugar dolls. So that night she set them all in front of the toy cabinet, as she had her sweets the night before. She kissed the shepherd, the shepherdess, and the lambs, and last of all the red-cheeked child. But she put the child in the last row. William Tell and the Maid of Orleans were up front. "This is dreadful!" cried Mrs. Stahlbaum the next morning. "There must be some horrid big mouse living in the toy cabinet, because all of poor Marie's sugar dolls have been nibbled and bitten." Marie couldn't hold back her tears, but she soon smiled again, for she thought, "What does it matter, since Nutcracker is saved?" That evening, when Mrs. Stahlbaum was telling the judge about the mischief a mouse had done in the children's toy cabinet, the doctor blurted out, "It's really too bad we can't get rid of that wretched mouse that's eating up all Marie's candy." "I've got it!" Fritz broke in. "The baker downstairs has an excellent gray legation secretary. I'll bring him up here, and he'll soon bite the Mouse King's the mouse's head off, even if it's Madame Mouserings herself, or her son, the King of the Mice." "Won't that be lovely?" said Mrs. Stahlbaum, laughing. "And he'll prowl around on the chairs and tables and knock all the cups and glasses over and do all sorts of damage." "Not at all," said Fritz. "The baker's legation secretary is as clever as they make them. I wish I could walk on the crest of the roof the way he does." "Please, no cats set in the house at night," begged Louise, who couldn't abide cats. "Actually," said the doctor, "Fritz is right. But we could set a trap instead. Haven't we got one?" "Godfather Drosselmeyer will make us one," cried Fritz. "He invented them." All laughed. And when Mrs. Stahlbaum informed them that there was none in the house, the judge said he had several, and within the hour he had an excellent mouse-trap brought from his own home. Fritz and Marie had their heads full of the judge's story about the hard nut. When Dora, the cook, was browning the fat, Marie trembled, and her mind filled with the story and its marvels. She said to Dora, whom she had known for years, "Oh, your Majesty, beware of Madame Mouserings and her family." Fritz drew his sword and cried, "Let them come! I'll give them more than they bargained for." But all remained quiet under the stove, and on top of it. As the judge was fastening the fat to a thin wire, and ever so quietly putting the trap down next to the toy cabinet, Fritz cried out, "Take care, Godfather Clockmaker, that the Mouse King doesn't play some trick on you." Oh, what a time Marie had that night! Something ice-cold scurried about on her arm. Something rough and disgusting lay down on her cheek and piped and squeaked in her ear. The horrid King of the Mice sat down on her shoulder. Blood-red foam poured from all 7 of his mouths, and gnashing and grinding his teeth, he piped and squeaked in her ear. "Hiss, hiss, hiss! Stay away from that house! Mustn't get caught, oh precious mouse! You'll have to miss the feast. Give us your picture books, give us your little dresses, or you'll have no peace. Nutcracker will be eaten alive. Hee, pee, pee, squeak." Marie was beside herself with anguish, and the next morning she was pale and distraught when her mother said, "That nasty mouse hasn't been caught." But believing that Marie was upset about her sweets and afraid of the mouse, her mother added, "Don't worry, child, we'll get rid of that wicked mouse. If the traps don't help, Fritz can bring in his gray legation secretary." No sooner was Marie alone in the parlor than she went to the toy cabinet and, sobbing, said to Nutcracker, "Oh, dear Mr. Drosselmeyer, what can I do for you? Poor unhappy child that I am! If I give that horrid Mouse King all my picture books, and even the beautiful dress the Christ child brought me, he'll just keep asking for more. I won't have anything left, and instead of you he'll want to bite me to pieces. Oh, poor me! What shall I do?" While thus weeping and lamenting, Marie noticed a big blood stain on Nutcracker's neck.
It had been there since the eventful night. Now that she knew that her Nutcracker was really young Drosselmeyer, the judge's nephew, she no longer carried him about in her arms, and had given up kissing and fondling him. Indeed, she felt rather shy about touching him altogether. Today, however, she took him carefully out of the cabinet and began to rub off the bloodstain with her handkerchief. Imagine how she felt when she suddenly noticed that Nutcracker was growing warmer in her hand and starting to move. Quickly she put him back on his shelf, and then his lips stirred, and he said in a strained whisper, "Oh, dear Mistress Stahlbaum, honored friend, I already owe you so much. You mustn't sacrifice your picture books or your little Christmas dresses on my account. Just give me a sword. A sword is all I need. I can manage the rest even if he—" At that his words ebbed away, and his eyes, which had been alive with the most fervent melancholy, became fixed and dead. Marie felt no fear. On the contrary, she danced for joy, for now she knew a way of saving Nutcracker without any more painful sacrifices. But where was she to find the little fellow a sword? She decided to ask Fritz for advice, and that evening, when their parents had gone out and the two children were sitting by themselves beside the glass cabinet in the living room, she told them the whole story of Nutcracker and the King of the Mice, and explained what was needed to save Nutcracker. What upset Fritz the most was hearing from Marie's lips that his hussars had given such a poor account of themselves in the battle. He asked her in dead earnest if that was really true, and when she gave him her word that it was, he went straight to the cabinet and treated his hussars to a stirring harangue. To punish them for their cowardice, he cut the insignia off their caps one by one and forbade their band to play the Hussars' March for exactly 1 year. After thus discharging his disciplinary duties, he finally turned to Marie. "I can get Nutcracker a sword," he said, "because only yesterday I pensioned off an old colonel of the cuirassiers. He won't be needing his fine sharp sword any more." The colonel in question was living on his pension in the hindmost corner of the third shelf. Fritz took him out, relieved him of his silver saber, and slung it around Nutcracker's waist. "Hello, Russia. Yes, I saw that. Welcome to the Nutcracker." The next night, fear and dread kept Marie awake. At the stroke of 12, she seemed to hear strange sounds, a clanging and a crashing in the parlor, and then suddenly, squeak! "The Mouse King! The Mouse King!" cried Marie. Stricken with horror, she jumped out of bed. All was still, but soon she heard a soft knocking at the door, and a faint little voice. "Esteemed Mistress Stahlbaum, open the door, and have no fear. I bring good news." Recognizing young Drosselmeyer's voice, Marie threw on her dressing gown and opened the door. There stood Nutcracker, holding the bloody sword in his right hand and a wax candle in his left. The moment he saw Marie, he went down on his knee and said, "You alone, dear lady, gave me the courage and strength to fight the insolent varlet who dared to defy you. The treacherous King of the Mice has been vanquished and lies writhing in his blood. Deign, dear lady, to accept these tokens of victory from the hand of one who will be your true and faithful knight until death." With that, Nutcracker adroitly stripped off the Mouse King's 7 golden crowns, which he had been wearing on his left arm, and handed them to Marie, who accepted them with delight. Then Nutcracker rose to his feet and continued, "Oh, Mistress Stahlbaum, what splendid things I can show you in this hour of victory over my enemy. If you will be kind enough to follow me a little way, come with me, I beg you, dear mistress." And that's the end of Victory. The last part of the story is The Land of the Dolls, which I will read in next episode. So, there at the bottom, we've got a little picture of the crowns. The light's not terribly great for it, but yay! Thanks. You're welcome. You're most welcome. I love doing things like this, and I'm really happy that I can share one of my favorite Christmas stories on Christmas and around Christmas. So, you're very welcome, and thank you for taking time out of your Christmas to listen. Season's greetings and happy holidays. The story is not popular in Italy because of the dark parts of it, or because of the ballet, or it's just not well known. I'm curious now.
Because oftentimes you see the ballet, but the ballet doesn't, it often doesn't contain the story of the hard nut, which is a big part of it. The ballet, yes. Yep. So the ballet itself, the ballet is what's not popular. Yeah. Often people don't realize that the ballet is based on a book. I tell that to people and they're like, "What?" But so the copy of the book that I'm reading is the one illustrated by Maurice Sendak. By the way. And he designed the set for the ballet is more popular than the story. That's probably that's the same over here. You see the ballet a lot, but not the story. But, okay, I'm going to sign off. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you, web viewers. Thank you, Hal. At least in Italy. Yep. Merry Christmas to all, and to all a good night. Although that's sort of Christmas Eve.